guys, and welcome back to another video. My name's Amber and I upload beauty and true crime content. If that's the type of videos that you like to watch, then why not hit that subscribe button and come along and join our little family. And if you're already part of the family, then make sure that notification bell switch on just so you're notified of whenever I upload a video. Why not give me a thumbs up and leave us a comment down below. And now we can get into today's video. And I would maybe suggest grabbing a little bit of a cup of tea for this one, because this is going to be a long ass case. But before we get into today's True Crime Tuesday case, I just want to give you a quick disclaimer. I like to do a bit of a warning that this does contain adult content. I will give a little bit of an extra warning to this case that it is quite gruesome and grisly. That might make you feel uncomfortable. If you want to click off this video, there's plenty others on my channel. Feel free to do so. Otherwise, I do not mean any disrespect to anyone mentioned in this video. I literally just curated the case together to bring it to you guys to inform people about it. So let's get right into today's case. So today's case is actually about a guy called Charles Albright, and he was known as the eyeball killer. So that is a pre-warning. You can tell by what his nickname was that he wasn't a nice guy. Charles was born on August 10th in 1933 in Texas. When he was just 3 years old, he was actually adopted by a lady called Dell Albright and her husband Fred. He was a Dallas greengrocer while Dell was a school teacher. The Albrights lived in a middle-class all-white neighbourhood of Oak Cliff. Back then it was a beautiful residential area across the river from downtown. Charles was known by most to be good-natured and was an easy-to-please child. He was a very intelligent child. With the help of his adoptive mother Dell, his education was actually accelerated and this made him skip 2 grades. Dell was known as a very overprotective and strict parent, but she did make sure that Charles would always know that she would be there for him and she would never abandon him. When he was less than a year old, Dell actually put him in a dark room for punishment for chewing on her measuring tape. She was worried that he would get sick and end up in hospital. When he wouldn't take a nap, she would actually tie him to his bed, and when he wouldn't drink his milk, she would spank him. Dell seemed overprotective, but friends assumed this was because she'd not raised a child before. Dell actually introduced Charles to the world of taxidermy when he was 11 years old. She enrolled him in a mail order course, which was at the Northwestern School of Taxidermy. As Charles set to work on the dead birds he found, Dell was right beside him. She showed him how to use all of the tools, the knife used to cut the skull, the little spoon used to scoop out the brains, and the scalpel required to cut the eyes from their sockets. She even skinned the first bird for him and taught him not to cut too deeply. Dutifully, Charles spent hours on his taxidermy courses. He stuffed and mounted his birds and he made them look as real life as possible. And then when it came to him finishing off them, he was looking for the crowning touch, and that was what he said was the eyes. The eyes were the crowning touch, the finishing touch of his taxidermy. Dell had other ideas, as she claimed that taxidermist eyes were just far too expensive. Charles would visit a taxidermist shop and just stare at all these different eyes, hoping and praying that his mother would buy them to put on these birds he'd stuffed, but she was having none of it. She claimed they were just far too expensive and that there was a cheaper way, and she knew exactly what they could do. To Charles, they were his first works of art. Everyone would come to the house and they would peer into the cabinet to see what he had made, and their peering back would be these birds, beautiful, lifelike, but blind. The birds had no eyes. Instead, sewn tightly against their delicate feathered faces were 2 dark buttons. His criminal career started early. At the age of 13, he was already a petty thief and he was arrested for aggravated assault. At the age of 15, he graduated from school and forged his way into North Texas University. At the age of 18, the police caught him. They caught him stealing petty cash from a cash register, and he had 2 handguns and a rifle on him. One of Charles's relatives said that he pilfered things from stores because his mother was so stingy, or another reason was maybe that he was rebelling against his mother. His mother tried to make things right and tried to reimburse the store owners for all that was taken, and Dell even tried to persuade the judge to let her act as Charles's lawyer, and she even asked to take her son's place in prison. Charles went to prison for a year, spending his entire 18th birthday there. So after his release in 1952, he attended the Arkansas State Teachers College and soon became one of the most popular students. He was known as both a goody two-shoes and an all-American fraternity boy and a good college prankster. So he was sort of a good all-rounder. Everyone sort of got on with him and loved him. Teachers College was a way of a new start for Charles. He actually told his probation officer that he wanted to mend and fix his ways, until one day Charles actually played a prank on his what he was his best friend at the time, Andrew. Andrew had broken up with his girlfriend, and after the separation he tore up several photographs of her and he threw them in the trash can in his dorm room. Weeks later, Andrew got a new girlfriend and asked her for a photo. One night while Andrew was staring at his new girlfriend's picture, he realised that something was really wrong. He looked closer and it seemed her eyeballs had been cut out and replaced with the eyeballs of his old girlfriend. Andrew looked up at the ceiling and there, staring down at him, was another pair of his old girlfriend's eyeballs. More eyeballs were above the urinals, in the men's bathroom, down the hall. No matter where Andrew turned, he was confronted by signs of his old girlfriend. The story soon raced through the school. Charles, being a jokester that he was, had basically gone and pulled the photographs out of the trash and saved his mate's girlfriend's eyeballs, pictures of them, just for the right time. At the time, do you think any of his fellow students found it a bit strange? Of course not. They just thought it was a prank. So he began to date a lovely young English major who was called Bette Heister, and he made plans to marry her. He married his college girlfriend and they had a daughter. Charles' wife was a teacher, but he failed to hold on to a job for long. In 1965, he and his wife separated, finally divorcing in 1974. In 1969, Charles began teaching high school science in Crandall, a small town east of Dallas. The principal at Crandall was looking for a teacher the entire summer when Charles, a young, ecstatic, astute man, so Charles called the principal up and he was absolutely over the moon and overjoyed because he'd been searching so long for the teacher and he just seemed so right for the job. According to his college records, Charles had a master's degree in biology from East Texas State University and he was working on another master's in counselling and guidance. Charles had forged all of his transcripts. He had never even earned a bachelor's degree. Everything his degrees, his teacher certificate had been faked. Charles had slipped into 3 different offices at East Texas State, grabbed all the necessary forms, copied them, added his name, forged signatures and then sneaked them back into his files. He had even stole the registrar's typewriter so the typeface on the records would look the same. Charles was confronted and admitted to his crimes. He simply explained he needed the job and he had to bend the rules in order to get it. Due to forgery being a victimless crime and because Charles was charming, the school decided to keep the transcript out of the newspapers. It would be embarrassing for the school since they didn't do any relevant background checks on Charles. Charles did, however, plead guilty to fraud and received a year's probation. This incident was kept very, very quiet. There was no trial, no headlines. The district attorney had arranged for him to serve a probation sentence of 10 years, which meant no jail time. To him, probation was fine. Just as it was in 1971 when he'd been arrested for forging some cashier's checks, and in 1979 when he was caught shoplifting 2 bottles of perfume. In 1980, he was sent to prison for stealing a saw from Handy Dan. He had to serve 6 months, but then at least his mother could tell everyone that he was leaving Dallas temporarily to take an important job on a nuclear power plant in Florida. In 1981, after his mother died, while visiting some friends, he sexually molested their daughter. The girl's parents wanted to keep the matter quiet, especially because they were church-going folk and they didn't want their daughter to be stigmatised. The family wanted Charles to pay, but they were worried that if they fought the story in court that it would leak and they didn't want any backlash for the daughter. So in 1985, in a nearly empty courtroom, he stood and he confessed to the judge that he'd knowingly and intentionally engaged in a deviant sexual intercourse with a girl under the age of 14, and at this time he was 51. In late 1985, Charles fell in love with a girl called Dixie Austin. She was pretty shy and a widow who he'd met on a trip to Arkansas. By the time Charles met Dixie, he'd already created another life for himself. He did, however, manage to masterfully hide secrets from everyone who knew him. He was a veteran of red light districts all over Dallas. Some prostitutes knew him as a regular client, and he was even a sugar daddy to others such as Susan Peterson, who would become Charles' second victim. Perhaps it was no coincidence that Charles' life began to spin out of control after the death of his parents. Without them around to look out for him, a repressed part of him may have finally unleashed itself. Dell, his mother, died of cancer in 1981 and they were not close in their last few years. Surprisingly, he did weep at her funeral, and maybe this was because he was wrecked with grief, or maybe he felt guilty over the way he'd let her down over the years, you know, being arrested for all these petty crimes. He also cried at his dad's funeral a year later. Frankly, it had not been until after Delle's death that Frank and Charles had grew close. Fred, Charles's dad, had a fatal heart attack in 1986, which meant Charles inherited at least $96,000 along with all of his parents' homes and property in South Dallas. In the autumn before the killings began, during the day Charles put his carpenting skills to use around the house, installing new cabinets for the kitchen, adding a skylight to the bathroom. If he was preparing to be a modern day Jack the Ripper, none of his friends or family had any idea. In October, Charles made a strange move and he took a job delivering newspapers in the middle of the night for the Dallas Times-Herald. He would wake up around 3 in the morning, deliver papers on an Oak Cliff route between 4 and 6, and then be back in bed by 6:15. After the death of his adoptive mother, Charles had tried to trace his biological parents. His biological father could never be traced, but his mother was, and he found out that his mother was actually a nurse who had lived and died in Wichita Falls. However, Delle had actually, his adoptive mother, had painted this picture of Charles's mother, that she was this brilliant law student, and Charles had always been very hung up on this, at how successful his mother had been. As an adult, he had visited her several times in Wichita Falls and he had brought her gifts, yet somewhere in Charles's mind the connection between prostitution and motherhood had been made. It is possible that Charles was wrestling with a twisted version of the Madonna whore complex, unconsciously seeking revenge on the mother figures who disappointed him by associating them with prostitutes, the worst possible women he could find. Whatever the reason, if Charles truly decided the time had come to kill, he had put himself in the perfect position to do it. His paper route gave him an excuse and an alibi to be out at night. He had prostitutes who trusted him enough to let him take them on a little trip. He had his parents' old property just 10-minute drive south of the Star, which was a common meeting place for prostitutes, and this is where he could carry out many unseen murders and mutilations. And because the property was in his father's name, nothing could be traced back to him. December 13th, 1990, Charles's first victim turns up in an underdeveloped, almost forgotten low-class area of far south Dallas. She was a large woman, 156 pounds, and she was naked except for a t-shirt and a bra, which had been pulled up over her breast. Her eyes were shut, her face and chest were badly bruised. Apparently the killer had thought it best to beat her before firing a .44 caliber bullet into her brain. A resident of the neighbourhood was so horrified by what he saw, he brought out a flowered bedsheet to cover the body. A police officer on the scene immediately recognised the woman as Mary Pratt, who was aged 33, a veteran prostitute. While it was not unusual for prostitutes in the area to get their fair share of beatings, it was very, very unusual for a prostitute to turn up murdered. In fact, it was sort of unheard of, especially when it was someone like Mary Pratt. Mary wasn't brazen, she didn't stand on the street and flag down clients. She usually spent all of her money on drugs, so she would stand quietly on her corner wearing blue jeans, tennis shoes and a small t-shirt that showed off her boob. She occasionally, at the end of the night, she would ask one of her regulars to drive her home in South Dallas, a suburb of Lancaster. She actually lived with her parents, and Mary's parents were older retired people, and they didn't know about her sort of other life. They didn't know about her being into prostitution. They would actually call good night to her while she climbed into her childhood bed. Mary's case file was handed to John Westphalen, and he was a homicide detective at Dallas Police Department. Mary's killing was a dumped body case, one of the hardest types of murders to solve. She'd obviously been killed in one location and dumped somewhere else. There were no witnesses to either the killing or the dumping, no murder weapon, little forensic evidence, no fingerprints and no apparent motive. Mary could have been shot by just about anyone. Accompanied by his partner, John drove to the Dallas County Medical Examiner's office to watch the autopsy of Mary. Dr. Elizabeth Peacock began the examination. Elizabeth noted needle marks on Mary's arms, the Playboy bunny tattoo on her chest, the bullet hole in her head. She then opened Mary's eyes and made a shocking discovery. There were no eyeballs, no tissue, no nothing. She was utterly shocked. Mary Pratt's eyes had been cut out and removed so carefully that her upper and lower eyelids were undisturbed. This was not an operation taught in medical school. The killer had to know how to slip a knife in and around eyes, making sure not to injure the adjoining skin, then to cut the 6 major muscles holding the eye in the socket, as well as the rope tough optical nerve with the eyelid shut. It was impossible to tell the eyes were missing. Surely whoever did this had to have had practice on someone or something, and a lot of it. There is evidence that Charles was a friend of Mary's long before she became a prostitute. In the early 80s, Mary lived in South Dallas, in a neighbourhood where Charles's parents had long ago invested in cheap rental property. At that time, Charles was temporarily living in one of the rental homes. According to several sources, Charles had a brief fling with one of Mary's friends. He actually brought the lady he was seeing and Mary over to his house for parties. Several prostitutes had also said that when Mary began prostituting, Charles became one of her regular customers. Mary had told the prostitutes that Charles was willing to pay more than the going rate. February 10th, 1991, Charles's second victim, Susan Beth Peterson, was found. Her body was nearly nude. She was dumped on the same South Dallas road as Mary. She was 27 years old. She'd been shot in the chest, head and stomach. Her eyelids were closed. Because her body was discovered on the other end of the road, just outside the city limits, the jurisdiction for the case fell to the Dallas County Sheriff's Department. A detective named Larry Oliver, who had not heard about Mary's murder, was called to the scene. Oliver accompanied the body to the autopsy. The pathologist opened one eyelid, then the other. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Yet again, her eyes were removed and they'd been expertly cut out. When the pathologist mentioned that the Dallas Police Department had a similar case just 2 months earlier, Oliver did some checking. Within 24 hours, he travelled to the police department's homicide officers to see John Westphalen. Soon there were meetings with sergeants, lieutenants, and with the chief in charge of homicide. Everyone in the room knew what they were hunting for: a twisted, brilliant murderer, someone who dropped bodies on quiet residential streets where they were certain to be found the next morning. So suddenly, in the early morning hours of March 19th, the killer changed tactics. On Fort Worth Boulevard, another prostitute hung out a few miles from the Star. A prostitute named Shirley Williams emerged from the Avalon Motel, where she worked as a maid during the day and as a prostitute on the night. According to another prostitute who saw her, Shirley was wearing jeans and a yellow raincoat and appeared to be in a stuporous drug high as she tottered along the sidewalk. March 10th, 1991, 6 o'clock the following morning, the body of Shirley Williams was discovered. She'd been dumped on a residential street half a block from the elementary school in the heart of Oak Cliff. As children walked to school, they could see a naked woman crumpled against the curb. An unopened condom was beside her body. Shirley also had facial bruises and a broken nose, and she'd been shot through the top of her head and in her face. Another shocking discovery: just like the previous victims, her eyeballs had been removed. The autopsy on Shirley's body would show that the surgery had been hurried. The broken tip of an X-Acto blade was found embedded in the skin near her right eye. But there were still no witnesses, no murder weapon, no fingerprints. The killer had now escalated and switched up locations, just as the detectives had feared. The publicity about the case had sent the killer away from the Star and his South Dallas dumping ground. There was no telling where and when he would hit next. Once word of Shirley's murder spread, the Star Motel turned into a ghost town. Several weeks before, an officer named Cook explained that he had come to the office early one morning and answered a call from a woman who would not identify herself. The woman had been friends with Mary. Mary had met a man whom she'd briefly dated. He was a very nice man, she said, but he had an odd love for eyes. Ooh, how freaky. She also mentioned that he kept X-Acto blades in his attic, and Cook asked him for the man's name, and she responded by saying his name was Charles Albright. Officers began to dig around in Charles's records, and they discovered a string of thefts, burglaries and forgeries, and the charge of sexual intercourse with a child. At 2:30 in the morning on March 22nd, tactical officers burst through the front door of Charles's property and he was handcuffed and arrested. He never said a word. For a long time after Charles's arrest, most everyone involved in his case wondered whether the police had enough evidence to convict him of murder. Charles refused to confess anything. He acted as if he'd never heard of the names of the murdered prostitutes. Police searched every square inch of the South Dallas properties. They searched his Oak Cliff house 6 times. The FBI even brought in a high-tech machine that could see through walls. Although the searches produced an array of interesting items: carpenter's woodworking blades, X-Acto blades, at least a dozen true crime books. Behind Charles's hand-built fireplace mantle, police discovered a hidden compartment filled with pistols and rifles. None, however, turned out to be the weapons used in the crimes. The police struggled to find anyone who would admit to seeing Charles with any of the 3 prostitutes on the nights they were killed. Toby Shuck, who was a prosecutor working for the Dallas County District's Attorney's Office, had a trump card. For the first time in its history, the DA's office was going for a murder conviction based solely on controversial hair evidence. Days after Charles's arrest, the forensic lab reported that hairs found on the bodies of the dead prostitutes were similar to hair samples taken from his his head and pubic area. As evidence goes, hairs are not as conclusive as a fingerprint. It's impossible to tell how many other grey-haired men's hairs might look similar to Charles's hair under a microscope, yet in this case the lab kept running tests. Lab technicians said that hairs found on the blanket in the back of Charles's pickup truck were similar to the hair samples from the first two prostitutes killed, Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson. Hairs found in Charles's vacuum cleaner matched the hair from the third prostitute killed, Shirley Williams. Tina Connolly claimed that Charles was a regular of hers. He normally used to go and see her on an afternoon and she would never see him after dark, except she did see him cruise after dark one night. The night Shirley Williams disappeared. Tina took officers to a secluded field near Fort Worth Boulevard where Charles used to take her for sex. They had spotted a yellow raincoat just like the one Shirley was last seen wearing and a blanket. Hairs on the coat and blanket matched Charles's. Charles never testified. Throughout the trial, he sat quietly in his chair. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict and a life sentence, Charles was only convicted for one of the 3 murders, and that was for the murder of Shirley Williams. He is incarcerated in John Mount Psychiatric Unit in Lubbock, Texas. Maybe a private demon had been lurking since childhood when the eyes were left off his little stuffed birds. Just as he long ago wanted to have a bag full of taxidermist eyes, maybe he decided to collect the human eyes for himself. Where do we start with talking about this case and summing it up? Because this is one of the, if not the most disturbing cases I have ever, it's up there. I just don't even know. It's just, I don't understand. I don't understand what made him, like, he seemed to have a good upbringing. Well, I suppose his mum was quite harsh, maybe not the best upbringing. You just don't, I suppose the thing is, you don't know what goes on behind closed doors. I just, like, what makes people do these things? Like, those poor women, I'm just so glad that lady come forward and confessed to, like, and took the officers to where she used to see him as a client, so they found the raincoat and they could link him to Shirley's murder. Because if they hadn't linked him to Shirley's murder, he would, like, if they hadn't have found that coat and that evidence, he probably, well, he would have got off because he got off for the other 2 murders. I feel so sorry for the D's murders that he never got convicted for, because for all the police know that it was him and, like, the families will know it was him, like, they're not going to feel like any justice has been served for their family members that were murdered because they just couldn't find enough evidence. I mean, Charles is going to rot in jail. Like, he's never going to get out now for what he's done, and deservedly so, because he clearly wasn't going to stop killing. Like, he was going to continuously kill. I just think this is such an absolutely awful case, and I feel so, like, it's so horrible that a lot of these, like, serial killers, they do target, you know, vulnerable women, and it does tend to be women that have got themselves into the sex trade, women that are prostitutes. And it's so sad that these women get seen as worthless and get seen as nothing. But I just hope that the families have peace now. I'm just so glad this guy's behind bars and will never be able to hurt anyone again, because I think he could have killed a lot more women. Anyway, guys, I would love to know what your thoughts and feelings are on this case. Please let me know that down below, and I shall see you in the next one. Thanks so much for watching.
We wish you a Merry Christmas.